Howdy, folks. I am Dr. Erika Miley, clinical sexologist and licensed mental health therapist. Today is a bonus episode. Just you and me today. Just really wanted. 2025 keeps getting, wilder and wilder. And so, with all of the things that are happening in the world, the thing that is happening right now is our attention has been turned to very powerful men and sexual assault cases. So, trigger warning way up front. This might be a miss for you. If you struggle or have experienced any kind of sexual assault, this episode will be a tough one for you. We're going to talk all about power and control, sexual assault, Jeffrey Epstein, Sean Combs or P. Diddy, and how often especially right now, we're losing the moral of the story. We're losing the point. A lot of these stories are being sensationalized. The details of the cases are becoming lost because the focus of the men and their power is more important than any of the survivors of any of the things that these men and other accomplices did. So we're going to jump right in and buckle in. I think I got about 90 minutes for you. And I got several guides that will go with this episode. But again, this is bonus. So I'm trying to record and edit and get it out today for you because it just keeps going. The media attention, especially on Jeffrey Epstein and the involvement of our current administration and the conspiracy theories around it just keeps showing up. So let's go. Essentially, what we're going to try to do by the end of this training is that we're going to define power and control, coercion in sexual abuse and trafficking. I would do this episode live if I could, but the reality is there's so many things around social media. Like we can talk around the edges of this case if I did this live, but I want to be able to talk about what they did and who they hurt so that we can understand truly the role of power and control and coercion in sexual abuse and trafficking. I want you to be able to differentiate between the sexual behavior and acts and the underlying relational systemic abuse structures. I want you to be able to recognize grooming, trafficking, and institutional complicity in high-profile and everyday cases. And this is the most important part, apply trauma-informed, non-sensational clinical frameworks when working with survivors of sexual violence. I want you to understand how money and influence absolutely shapes the disclosure, reporting, and recovery of survivors. So this whole episode will not be about voyeurism. It's not going to be about scandal. We are going to talk about the intensity of the topic, though. We are going to lay out what these men have done. There's some of that seems sensational on its face. And I think that that's part of, at least when it comes to therapists and other healthcare providers, we are not often in our early graduate work, early medical school, early nursing school, whatever you did, we're not encouraged to not be distracted by the details, especially if it involves sex or sexual behaviors or sexual violence. We get distracted by those details and then it becomes scandalous. It becomes taboo. And quite often when we talk about cases like this, there is a voyeurism part of it. And, no shade, y'all. Like, I have listened to my fair share of true crime. I have done personally, just to kind of know my personal experiences working with these populations. I did sex offender treatment for 2.5 years in the state prison level inside the prison system. And I have worked with survivors of sexual assault and trafficking. And so I've worked with the entire cycle of violence. And so I feel like I have a unique perspective of these cases. So remember to check in with yourself, get your water, get your fidgets, get your things. If you need to skip it, skip it. Let's define some terms. We're going to define abuse, trafficking, coercion, and sexual violence. Essentially, abuse is a huge cycle of different things. It can be physical, it can be verbal, it can be neglect. That means like pulling away and not giving attention. It can be not giving attention in the sense of like, I want attention and so I should have it, and that I don't. It's traumatizing. No, it's more like if you're a child or a teenager and you need food, shelter, and clothing and loving, connected parents, and you don't have those things. Neglect can happen within marriages too, and within other kinds of relationships. Trafficking is when you essentially take a human and you sell that human for money for them to do different things. Now, it could be drug trafficking, it could be sex trafficking, it could be using their bodies to move drugs or drugs paraphernalia. Coercion is essentially using power to make somebody do something that they would not otherwise do. So coercion could be something like, I will hurt your family if you do not fill in the blank. Sexual violence is when any person experiences sexual behavior, sexual touch that they did not want, that they said no to, or even implied a no, or are under the age of consent, that they cannot give consent to those things. So that is its own episode. We can talk about consent in a whole other episode, and age of consent and all of those things in a whole other episode. Those are just a very, very brief overview of the defining terms that we're going to be talking about here. So this first case, we're going to do this case study first of Jeffrey Epstein, and we're going to talk about the basics. Again, this is not about voyeurism. We're not going to do deep dives on the conspiracy theories or any of those things. Essentially, I want you to know who, because there are people, for those of you who know about Jeffrey Epstein, and I can't tell you how many of my clients have come to me and had talked about this case and are shocked when other people don't know about it. So we're going to go through it because there are people who don't know anything about this. So who was Jeffrey Epstein? He was a wealthy financier and convicted sex offender who maintained connections with influential individuals across politics, academia, and entertainment. His wealth and network helped him avoid consequences for many, many years. His crimes, he was first investigated in the early 2000s for sexually abusing underage girls, often recruiting them under the guise of massage work. So you can come do massages for these wealthy people or modeling work and come to these parties and be models, and we'll get you the career of your dreams. So that's coercion. That in itself is coercion. Many of these girls were vulnerable, economically disadvantaged, and targeted through grooming tactics. Ultimately, it also seems that a lot of these girls were they were vulnerable, but they were also part of like different high, like what would be considered like higher class universities or art schools or things like that. So Ivy League, those were the words I was trying to say. Like Juilliard and Harvard and lots of different other places. They would find these girls that couldn't necessarily afford to be there, and were from a different economic class, and would target them and make promises to them. In 2008, there was a non-prosecution deal in a widely criticized plea deal that was brokered by then U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta. Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state charges, solicitation and prostitution, and solicitation of a minor, and served just 13 months. I'm going to say that again. 13 months, a year and a month, y'all, in a Florida jail with work release privileges. Now, that quotation marks of work release, I think is important to understand, because the power differential here, he could go to work. He could leave the jail and go to work and come back. There is work release type programs that wouldn't allow you to like go back to your house, go to your special offices, and then come back to the prison. Work release is usually not that bougie. As far as having worked with people who ended up doing work release, it is not as fancy as what he had access to. Let me be very, very clear. He had these work release privileges. Mind you, he still had dozens of potential federal charges. and survivor testimonies. I just, 2019. This, again, we are skipping a lot of time here. We're skipping a lot of stuff because this is not about the sensation. 2019, he was arrested, and in July of 2019, and these charges were federal sex trafficking charges. He died by suicide officially. That was the ruling in a Manhattan jail the following month, sparking widespread public outrage and disbelief due to the suspicious circumstance surrounding his death. Now, there is a lot of time spent right now in today, the day of our Lord, July 18th, 2025. There's a lot of speculation in the involvement of a lot of different people in this man's death. And there's a lot of outrage right this minute in many people wanting more access to this man's files around what crimes he committed, who was involved, lists. There's a lot of it. Something to keep in mind is that Ghislaine Maxwell, she didn't owe me saying her name right anyway. Let me get start. Epstein's longtime associate was convicted in 2021 for facilitating Epstein's abuse. Survivors testified that she actively recruited and groomed underage girls. Her conviction confirmed the scope of the trafficking ring. So if you want a really good deep dive on like the involvement of Maxwell, what some of these conspiracies are, like that's not my job. Under the Dex News v. Spear on American Fever Dream and on their Substack, they are doing a really good job. So go check that out if you really want all of that information. That is not what we are here to do today. You have the most basic information. That is what you need. So this is how survivor harm was hijacked, truly, by conspiracy and political power. The Epstein case has revealed a deeply rooted system of abuse. But instead of centering survivors, here we are again, the public discourse has often been co-opted by conspiracy theories, like Epstein didn't kill himself. Those were QAnon narratives and other narratives from lots of different people. There are many people across the political spectrum that believe that he did not kill himself, which distract from the real trauma and evidence survivors presented in court. Muting my things so they don't ding at us when you think you have muted all technology, but it just hasn't happened. So let's move on. Essentially, this case has been politically weaponized, both left and right-leaning figures using Epstein's associations to attack opponents. Clinton versus Trump debates are rampant across the left-wing, right-wing conversations, and really, truly, instead of pushing for systemic accountability. Now, and that is, I think, my biggest beef with this case in particular, is that we are so distracted by the details, who's involved, who's not involved. We are not paying attention to the survivors, and we are not paying attention to how we could change a system that is absolutely corrupted with power and money. Survivors and advocates have repeatedly noted that their stories were drowned out by the sensationalism, the meme culture, reducing a serious pattern of abuse to viral content or clickbait. Little systemic change has followed. Elite networks remain mostly unchallenged. Epstein's powerful friends remain unnamed in the official record, and survivor-led justice efforts are underfunded. And I wish I was surprised. Therapists, healthcare providers, your takeaway is when working with survivors of trafficking or systemic abuse, avoid distraction by spectacle. Don't let conspiracies or celebrity focus distort the core issue. Abuse was enabled by wealth, power, and systemic indifference. That, I can tell you, that is not only just something that I see again and again in these higher profile cases, in the cases of many of the men that I worked with in the prison setting, the power of the organization of wherever that person maybe came from, especially religious organizations. Some of them were hidden or moved for a very long period of time. And a lot of that had to do with power. It wasn't about protecting the survivors. So you, as healthcare providers, you must resist and stay survivor centered. Ask who benefits from this narrative shift and who is being silenced. Help clients name what grooming, coercion, and exploitation look like, even when it comes in expensive clothes or elite environments. Those ones in particular are incredibly seductive. Now, does that mean that that is the survivor's fault? No. But it is helpful for us to understand the seductive nature of power and wealth, or power and community, especially in religious organizations or larger organizations where especially children and teenagers are harmed the most often. Next case, Sean Combs or P. Diddy. You know, I tell you what, my childhood and teenage people are just, letting my generation down a lot. We had Cosby, we have P. Diddy, we have R. Kelly. There's so many. Weinstein. I mean, Weinstein, those movies were a lot of those movies are a little older than me, but still, there's so many people during that era that just absolutely breaks my heart as a young one that still lives inside, that loved some of Diddy's music. But here we are. So again, here we are with the basics of the Diddy case. Sean Diddy Combs is a music mogul, producer, and entrepreneur who rose to fame in the 90s and early 2000s. He has built a multi-million-dollar empire in music, fashion, and spirits, wielding massive cultural influence, particularly in hip-hop and R&B. The civil lawsuit was the first lawsuit that was filed. It was filed by his former partner, singer Cassie Ventura, and this was in November of 2023. Civil lawsuit alleging that Combs raped, physically assaulted, trafficked, and manipulated her during their 10-year relationship. The complaint detailed disturbing patterns of abuse, surveillance, and control. There was a very rapid settlement. Within 24 hours, Combs settled the lawsuit for an undisclosed amount of money without admitting wrongdoing. The speed of the settlement raised questions about silencing survivors and avoiding public scrutiny. Multiple additional allegations. Since Cassie's case, at least 6 other women and 1 man have filed lawsuits or come forward with allegations of sexual violence, abuse, drugging, trafficking involving Combs. Allegations span decades, including claims from music industry professionals, employees, and romantic partners. Federal investigation. Like, I'm sighing over here. I'm remembering when the video of when Combs assaulted Cassie came out. It was in early 2024. Homeland Security raided Combs's homes in a federal sex trafficking case. So that is essentially what resulted after the civil case. And that is when the surveillance footage surfaced showing Combs assaulting Cassie in a hotel hallway, directly contradicting earlier denials and intensifying public backlash. He denied and denied and denied that he ever laid his hands on Cassie. And it was very, very clear in that video that he absolutely did. And there have been many, many rumors since the 90s and early 2000s that Combs was an abuser, essentially. And here we are again. How survivor harm is being overshadowed by power and celebrity and PR spin. Media narratives have shifted quickly from the allegations to what will happen to Diddy's brand. Survivors are often cast as opportunists despite extensive corroborating evidence, like video. And it's very, very clear video. You can't miss it. Celebrity protection culture has been in full force, initially offering Combs cover through legacy, admiration, and corporate ties. Critics of the survivors flooded comment sections, spreading misogynoir and victim-blaming rhetoric. Like the things that we have heard, and this is something that we hear all of the time when it comes to survivors. Well, she knew what she was getting into. All of the rumors are about Diddy. Like, didn't she know? She knew who she was getting involved with. Again, like making it her fault, or saying things like, well, why did you do a civil case? It's just about money then for you. Oftentimes people do a civil case because they, as we have seen now that we have the conclusion of Diddy's trial, there were things that he was not convicted of. He has not been sentenced yet as of today, July 18th, 2025. And as of this morning, he apparently was going to rehab. So he's trying to look real good for sentencing. So we don't know what the sentence is going to be, but quite often people go civil lawsuits, especially in large cases like this, so that they can have some sort of ending to their story that doesn't involve the person not seeing any kind of punishment at all. Like in the Epstein first case, 13 months. 13 months is all that dude got. That's it. Fast settlements, PR statements, and legal counters have served to minimize accountability, framing the issue as a private matter rather than a public safety and systemic abuse issue. The cultural focus on Combs's business fallout, like revoked awards, canceled appearances, often overshadows the survivor's trauma, resilience, and pursuit of justice. He'll never work again, or nobody's listening to his music anymore, or any of those things, rather than focusing on what this person did to women and a man he has now been convicted of. Lots of evidence. But people are still blaming the survivors. So again, therapist, healthcare provider takeaway. When working with clients impacted by high-profile sexual abuse cases, name the power dynamics clearly. Wealth plus fame can equal immunity. Help clients separate survival reality from cultural gaslighting. Validate the triggering impact of public disbelief, especially for BIPOC survivors. Talk about how public scrutiny can reactivate trauma. So, especially with cases that go in and out of trials, it can absolutely reactivate the survivor's trauma. And then they have to go through the entire thing all over again. And most of the time, they opt to do that so that they can help the next people who were hurt. Use this information, all of this information that you hear about in the media, use it as a teaching moment for discussing grooming, coercive control, and use of reputation and wealth to maintain silence and power. Please resist the urge to sanitize reality in the name of neutrality. Ethical therapy requires moral clarity when harm is clear. Let me say that again. Resist the urge to sanitize reality in the name of neutrality. Ethical therapy requires moral clarity when harm is clear. This is this is something that I think can happen for many healthcare providers, especially if you've experienced anything yourself that resembles sexual assault or sexual harassment or any kind of power differential that resulted in your harm. It's very, very hard because it brings up a lot of stuff inside of you. But resist that urge to sanitize it. Now, I wanted to bring another case to you because I think I wanted to show you a case that it's so clear how different we handle a case when the money and power are absent. We do. We handle it entirely differently. We talk about it entirely differently. So this is the case of Alan Lewis Mirhoffer. Age is 72. Background is was known as a violent sex offender with a criminal history dating back to 1988. previously civilly committed for 17 years due to sexual violence against children. Now, what civil commitment means is it's different in every state. This is a Washington state civil commitment, is that we have a center, essentially, in Washington state where if a crime that was committed, that we need something past a criminal conviction. So essentially, we get a criminal conviction of a crime like this, like Mirhoffer, after they have served the time for the criminal side of the crime. We have a board that can say, you are still a danger. We can take a case, essentially a civil case against that person to say, hey, you can't get out in public yet. You are too dangerous. And so that is what happened in this case. So he was in civil commitment for 17 years. The crimes that he committed, he reoffended after civil commitment. So after he got out of civil commitment, because when you go into civil commitment, it doesn't mean you're there forever. He reoffended by grooming teen boys, offering gifts, and exploiting them digitally. He ran a Telegram group for pedophiles. So pedophilia is, quick note, again, whole other episode. Pedophilia is when somebody, it is a diagnosis, is when somebody is attracted to prepubescent children. They are not a pedophile if they are attracted to pubescent children. I know that that's a hard distinction, but that's what those of us who actually use the diagnosis, that is the distinction to us. Not everybody who harms somebody under the age of 18 is a pedophile. And that, again, whole other conversation. We'll talk about it later. So again, ran a Telegram group for pedophiles, sharing child sexual abuse material, or CSAM, coordinating exploitation. Repeated and deliberate use of technology, Google, Instagram, Telegram, to groom, exploit, and traffic. Telegram is a messaging service very similar to Signal and WhatsApp, end-to-end encrypted. Past crimes include knife point rape, home invasion, kidnapping of minors. Sentence and response, sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after being arrested in 2021. Prosecution emphasized his lack of remorse, refusal of treatment, and his danger to children. Labeled by prosecutors as every parent's worst nightmare. There was no media spectacle, no PR campaign, no brand to protect. Again, these patterns repeated, same patterns that we're seeing for Combs and Epstein. Grooming, shame, power imbalance, but in this case, silence. One of the guides that I have for you for this episode is essentially a comparison between all three cases and how different each one of them are with public perception. Again, spoiler alert, there has been no coverage of Mirhoffer, no brand to protect, no long podcasts about it, but here we are. The key takeaway is we, as a society, will frame someone as a monster. This is the takeaway for healthcare providers and therapists. Mirhoffer absolutely fits the cultural archetype. Old, white, isolated, visibly creepy, doesn't have any money, doesn't have power, doesn't have political power behind him, but we will incarcerate. We will try to protect the community, which in this case didn't work. But with these other cases, we will focus squarely on Combs and Epstein versus the survivors and what they're dealing with as a result of all of this attention. Epstein and Combs had money and charm and institutions invested in protecting their image, making it harder for the public to see them clearly as perpetrators. Survivors of high-profile perpetrators face disbelief, doxing, re-traumatization, and societal minimization. We need to shift our focus back to what was done instead of why. Therapists, healthcare providers, everybody are often distracted by the shock factor of sexual acts, especially in high-profile abusers, as I've said before. We pivot are focused to power, control, coercion, and access, not just the salacious behavior. So, what is the clinical application? Educate clients and ourselves. If you're listening, you're doing that right now. Good job. On how power shields people from accountability. Watch for survivor comparison syndrome. It's just a fancy way to say that we will compare survivors. Well, it wasn't that bad. He wasn't like that guy on TV. Recenter the story on survivors' voices, not perpetrators' PR spins or conspiracy fanfare. I think that it would be really, really important to have a better understanding of power and control in itself. Now, we have the handy dandy power and control wheel. Now, many of you have probably seen this. You've probably seen this and even probably used it in your practices, perhaps, or maybe even seen it from when you've gone to trainings and things. There's tons of places that have these. I have paper versions of this that I give to my students from the YWCA here in Washington, but I'm going to show you here on the screen. I'm going to share my screen so that you can take a look at the power and control wheel. We're just looking at this. We're going to go beyond the power and control wheel because to me, that there is a very large importance in seeing beyond the power and control wheel because of how people and children are harmed now. There's so many different ways, and it doesn't mean that the power and control wheel is out of date. It's very important, but I think we need to add to it. So I'm going to share my screen here. Here we are. So this is the power and control wheel. It is in a wheel form because this is quite often a cycle. You have at the root of power, the root is power and control. What is the power and control? And these are essentially examples of power and control. Using intimidation, using emotional abuse, using isolation, so cutting people out or not including them or isolating them from how they need to earn money or gain food or any of those things. Minimizing, denying, blaming, essentially deflecting back on the person, to blaming them for the problematic behavior or the sexual behavior. This could sound like, oh, well, what was she wearing or what was he wearing? What did they do to deserve it? So that's that minimizing, denying, and blaming. Using children. So using children to maintain control over someone else. So that's like in a domestic violence situation where the partners are having where the abuse is between the two partners, children are often witnessing abuse, and the children become a tool by the abuser. Well, I'll take the children unless you stay, or I'll hurt the children unless you stay. There's lots and lots of versions of this. Using male privilege. Now, that's its own deep dive. Like, this could look like using the access to the finances of the house. And that's the next one, using the economic abuse. So keeping money, not allowing the other partner to be involved in the management of the money, or hiding money, or hiding bills, or hiding sexual materials. And I'm not talking about like consensual adult sexual materials. I'm talking about CSAM. Using coercion or threats. We talked about this already. This is essentially like, if you don't do this, I will do this. I will take the kids. I will hurt you. I will hurt the children, or I will. One of the digital versions of this, and we're going to talk about this in a second, is I have those nudes of yours. I will let those out. Or it can also be coercion and threats is nobody's going to love you. That can be also intimidation. Nobody's going to love you like I do. All of this is rooted in power and control, trying to maintain the power over someone and the control of their behaviors, their actions, and trying to keep that person doing or not changing the situation in any way. Now, many people have, especially many people in the therapy field, have seen the power wheel before. It is one of the more basic things that you learn about when you are early in your trauma training, or if you've worked with domestic violence survivors, or if you've worked in sexual assault as well, or with sexual assault. Power and control is the root. And quite often, as I mentioned before, people are distracted by the sexual details, the violent details, or even, like in these cases, the power and money or the other salacious details. Now, I think now that you have seen the power and control wheel and have been reminded, it doesn't, again, fully capture how abusers use mobile technology to track movements or other kinds of abuse. So many people are using things like Mirhoffer, using things like Signal, other applications, hidden devices like AirTags, GPS, shared locations, all of those kinds of things to keep track of the people they're abusing. They control communication by demanding constant texting, proof of whereabouts, or FaceTime check-ins, like show me who's around, show me who's with you, show me what you're wearing, those kinds of things. They will monitor online activity using shared accounts, screen monitoring apps, or spyware. They can impersonate or humiliate using photos, using, like I mentioned before, sextortions. If you've made a sexy video together, or you've sent each other nudes, they threaten to use those against you and put them on social media, send them to your family, send them to your friends, send them to your boss, or other kinds of social media manipulation. So, how can you help? Introduce the concept of agile technological surveillance in safety planning conversations. Many survivors don't realize these behaviors are abuse. They've been normalized or disguised as caring, or I'm just checking in. Expand risk assessments to include digital control. Incorporate these questions into your assessments. Does your partner know where you are even when they're not with you? Do they ask you for your passwords or use your devices? Have you ever felt unsafe because of something that happened online or via your phone? Have you changed your behavior out of fear of what they might see or say? Be aware digital abuse may persist after separation, often covertly. I have worked with many abuse survivors who their former partners would bluejack them. So they would use their Bluetooth devices against them and log into some of their applications and play music really, really loud at very early hours of the morning so that they couldn't sleep, or use like security devices to try to continue to maintain control or vision over people inside the house, using Amazon accounts to continue to track, using other kinds of devices to just try to get the version of your history just to see what you are doing and who you're with or what you're watching or what you're doing to try to maintain any kind of control over you. Integrate the updated tech-enabled wheel in education and support. The authors have created an adapted version of the power control wheel to account for technologically facilitated coercion. While the full image is behind the paywall, this revised model emphasizes constant reachability as control, online humiliation or outing, device-based surveillance, threats using shared cloud data or photos. Because remember, when you delete something off your phone, that does not mean it's gone. You have to remember all of the things that are uploaded to the cloud part of your storage if you're going to try to delete images or delete videos or delete other kinds of information. How to help. Educate survivors that control can now look like, let me have your location so that I know that you're safe. Again, if that is happening in a very early in a relationship, that isn't appropriate. There are many people. Me and my partner, we have our location shared, but we also have our location shared of our child. And we've been married for 17 years. It is not about control. It is about, are they still at the grocery store so I can tell them that there's something missing from the list? And with our child, it's to make sure that our teenager is not doing things they're not supposed to be doing. Oh my goodness, what my parents would do if they had access to that when I was a teenager. Back to the abuse, though. We should share an iCloud account so we don't lose anything. Why are you taking so long to reply to my texts? Help them see and name the coercion, especially when it's digitally enabled. Support digital autonomy as part of healing. Digital disconnection can feel impossible or even dangerous for survivors, especially when financial abuse or child custody issues are involved. Something that you can say to reframe as a clinician: let's talk about what digital safety looks like for you. How can we build in small steps towards more digital privacy? What would it mean to have control over your own technology again? Consider referrals to digital safety advocates or use materials from, there's several organizations that actually do this: NNEDV's Safety Net Project, Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, and the Coalition Against Stalkerware. All three of those I'll make sure are in the guides so that you can find them and access them and be able to give them to your people. Train yourself and colleagues. Take this information, send them this video. Therapists must update our frameworks. We really need to. Traditional models like the power and control wheel are still incredibly helpful, but we need to layer on tech-based control and awareness. Attend trainings on digital coercion, cyber and cyber intimate partner violence, and trauma-informed tech safety. Build relationships with DV orgs that specialize in this kind of abuse, like Westnet in Australia or the Clinic to End Tech Abuse in New York. Now, I would encourage you to think about too, and this episode's coming, I'm going to do a deep dive on the AIs that are showing up in our electronic health record systems. Stay tuned for that. But think about what those systems are going to do, especially if you work with survivors, and with that information, is that information going to be vulnerable? We all have to think about digital information entirely differently, and this is just another example. So the TLDR for therapists: control doesn't always look like bruises. Sometimes it looks like your find my iPhone settings. Update safety planning and assessments to reflect tech-based abuse. Teach survivors how coercion now shows up through apps, devices, and digital communication. Use the updated wheel to talk about online power and control. Offer harm reduction steps towards digital independence. Be humble. Tech abuse is evolving fast. Stay curious and trauma-informed. It is all abusive dynamics pivot on domination, not desire. We as therapists must get clearer. We are trained to name trauma, not to excuse it. I have a guide, another guide. I love a guide with language shifts for trying to ask questions of those who have been harmed, specifically if, they've been dealing with trafficking. Did anyone else, instead of saying, were you trafficked? Did anyone else control where you went or who you saw? Instead of asking the question, why didn't you leave? The question should be, what would have made it safe for you to leave? Not the question, are you in danger now? Instead, ask, what kind of support would feel helpful or empowering right now? This is quite often a mistake that, these are mistakes essentially that therapists make. We focus on the sexual acts instead of the coercion. We ask, why didn't they leave, instead of what would have made it safe to? And we quite often have an unconscious bias about who looks like a victim or a perpetrator. We have to think through, what does it mean to challenge ourselves, to practice ethical curiosity, document with protection. So documenting our people's experiences as much as necessary. That doesn't necessarily mean exactly what the insurance company wants or what somebody needs that is going to pay us. There's always other language we can use. And remember, when you're working with a case, to think through who has access to it. I can't tell you how many times where somebody's relationship, we're working through safety planning, and they forget that that person is their emergency contact and might have access or have given access in the past to their health records. So I have to remember, or I have to remember to go look to be sure, is that person listed as having access to this person that I'm working with their medical records. And then I will bring it back to session and ask them, hey, do you want this person to continue to have access to your records? And then they get to make the decision on whether or not they do or not. Oftentimes they say no, and they remove that person from having access to their health records. And they give access to another emergency contact. We have to avoid re-traumatizing via disbelief or rescue models. This can be like really pushing a timeline on a survivor and having a lot of judgment if they go back to a perpetrator. I think I encourage all my people that I know, any consultation I've ever done, any therapist I've ever worked with, stay in consultation, stay in supervision. It really can help us spot any kind of language minimization that we're doing, or when we're on burnout, because I don't know about y'all, but a lot of this stuff causes me to be teetering on the edge of burnout all the friggin' time. So staying in consultation helps me see that more clearly and be able to challenge that and take time off, or really be much more aware of my language when I'm feeling that way. I think we need to think about trafficking and silence differently. We think trafficking looks like a Liam Neeson movie. We think it looks very, very specific, and in reality, it can look a lot of different ways depending on the community. I think having that understanding going to trainings, understanding what trafficking can look like in your own community is really, really, really important. Finding out who is often trafficked in your community is really, really, really important, because again, what that looks like in one community might look different in another community. That it is not always cages and chains when it comes to trafficking or any crimes like it. I've worked with people who were trafficked within OnlyFans. I've worked with people who were trafficked via Craigslist. It is these cases don't always look identical to one another. And how a person was accessed doesn't always look the same. There is a difference between relational trafficking, survival sex, and what can feel like to the survivor like gray zone trauma. So that relational trafficking could be that person has a power relationship over you. Could be a partner, it could be a boss, it could be something like that, where the power differential dictates then the movement into trafficking. Survival sex, quite often, essentially, it is what it sounds like, is that people will have what feels like consensual sex with someone, but there is power over them for food, housing, and other things like children. So you may feel coerced to have sex and to survive, so that you can live another day or not deal with that person's moods or not deal with the fallout. And then, of course, there's that gray zone trauma, which that person they may not even say that it feels traumatic to them. Or they'll compare it to other kinds of traumas, or maybe even true crime that they've seen. And they're like, that's not really, I didn't experience trauma, or I wasn't sexually assaulted because we were married. So it can feel like to them like a gray area, gray zone trauma. When you work with survivors, real trauma-informed care looks like affirming whatever their choices are, normalizing complex feelings. Now, you have to remember those choices may be different depending on their age. If this person is a child, they may have less choices when it comes to reporting than to. We as clinicians have to support without demanding a timeline for healing. And we have to recognize how trauma is a whole body experience. And again, isn't always linear. We have to remember that so many of us therapists and healthcare providers have experienced this too. I dealt with sexual assault as a teenager. I know so many of my fellow clinicians that have experienced sexual assault. When you have experienced that yourself, you have to keep that in mind What do you need for your own healing? What do you need for when you are getting essentially re-traumatized? What do you need to be able to support this population if you are in a state that you can? And you also have to be able to tell when you are in a state that you cannot. Oh my goodness. It's definitely Friday. So I do think that it's important that we talk about what it's like working with people who have caused harm, as I've worked with people who are in sex offender treatment here in Washington State. This, again, another warning, you may find this activating. This is probably this is the thing that I think probably every single one of us, when we were in graduate school, people would ask, what's the one population you don't want to work with? They would say sex offenders. And I went headlong into it because, one, it was fascinating to me. Yawn attack. It was fascinating to me, and it was something that I really wanted to understand, not only from my own experience, but I had family members as well that had these experiences. So I think making sure that if you need to opt out, now's yet another good time to opt out. We are not meant to become our people's saviors, and holding somebody accountable does not mean excusing them or becoming their savior. So I think this is probably when I was doing this work. I got a lot of negative feedback from people when they would find out what I did. I still get weird feedback being a sex therapist. Don't get it twisted. But like, in particular, when people found out that I was doing sex offender treatment, I would get, why would you work with those monsters? Why would you do that work? What's wrong with you? You must have been hurt yourself, with huge assumptions about what that is. That monsters don't deserve it. Put them on an island, light it on fire, heard everything. So I think understanding that we truly get distracted when we're working with people who have committed sexual crimes, that they have done this. And one of the things that I would tell people back then and even now is that most people who have committed a sex offense will get out of prison. And when they work in treatment, they are going into the community a little more safer. And most of the time, people had a pretty good response to that. We have to remember that a lot of our work here, like when we do work with those who have committed harm, we come from, as clinicians, we come from an accountability center inside of ourselves. So we come from that accountability, holding people accountable. It doesn't necessarily mean that like getting them to admit that they did a thing. It's more that they have to learn how to take accountability for having done harm and not minimizing the things that they've done. So essentially, it is a piece of trauma-informed care when you're working with those who've committed sex offenses. You're responsible for what happened, even if you didn't mean to, you did cause harm. Because there were many people that I worked with that had convinced themselves that they did not want to hurt someone. They had truly convinced themselves of that. Because and asking somebody to admit they're a monster is like, nobody's real motivated to do that. So you're essentially trying to interrupt minimization without shame, which is sometimes a very difficult needle to thread. It's uncomfortable to name what happened. So this is like one of the things I would say. It's uncomfortable to name what happened, but avoiding it doesn't make it disappear. And oftentimes when they would say something like, well, they were around me all of the time, I would say things like, well, and they were 13. That's something that 13-year-olds do. That was developmentally appropriate for them. What you did then in response was not developmentally appropriate. So there was a lot of, I'm not shaming you as a human, and I want you to be able to talk about this, and you have to be able to take accountability and not minimize what took place. It is not easy to sit with someone who has done something terrible and find that you have to hold the complexity and also not allow for any excuses. So yes, you can have experienced trauma yourself in your life, and you can be accountable for harm you've done. There is a lot of modeling repair and self-reflection So when you're working with people like that, you're actually doing a lot of modeling as a clinician yourself. And you don't rescue them from their own discomfort of emotions, of what they've done, of sexuality, of any of those things. You do not rescue them, because part of our job is teaching them how to sit with that and helping them by saying things like accountability is a process and it's not a punishment. I think our culture really struggles with this idea of accountability versus punishment. We struggle with when somebody has gotten held accountable for something they've done and lost something, whether it's they've gone to prison, they've gone to jail, or they've lost a platform. That is accountability. It's not punishment. And yet we treat it like it is punishment. You, as a clinician, if you're working with people who have harmed others, you have to learn to name the power dynamics explicitly. You can say something like, let's explore what you had access to that they didn't, physically, socially, or emotionally. Something that I would ask them is what they knew about power or what they knew about feeling powerless, so that they could even figure out what would that even feel like. Not because I wanted them to sit in the survivor's shoes. It was because I wanted them to understand what they were wielding, because quite often they didn't. Again, we're not talking about excuses. I'm describing what was often the case for the people I worked with. This was something I did a lot, was challenge entitlement narratives gently but firmly. Where did you learn that you were owed access to someone's body, time, or energy? So this one, I was one of the cases that I worked with, there was rape of a spouse, and the entitlement, well, I married them, so I am entitled to their body. When they signed that piece of paper, that meant they owed me sex. And so when I was working with this person, I would say things like, okay, where did you learn that from? Where did you learn that marriage equaled access to someone's body? And quite often it was from their parents or things that they'd seen in their family structures or systems. I have yet another guide for you. And this is directly for working with people who have caused harm. And it is the similar challenging of different kinds of language you can use. Instead of, did you mean to hurt them? You can say, what were you aware of in that moment about your actions were affecting other people? Consent was something that I spent a lot of time teaching about. And you have to remember, many of these people didn't commit crimes because they didn't know what consent meant. Teaching them about consent helps them understand that some of them were absolutely attracted to the power that they had over the person or child. And helping them understand that part of themselves was really, really important for them to understand what the risks were when they were out in the public. The guide is lengthy, so I'll let you read it rather than reading every single one to you. I'm going to give you a few resources. Like I said, I'll be like in the show notes and things like that, guides, all the things. The overarching big idea of this, what made me want to write this episode, was that abuse thrives in silence. We break that silence by being informed, compassionate, and alert. That silence can look like when everybody around you is talking about these cases, but yet they have yet to mention a survivor. They've yet to mention the system that has not been impacted, that continues to benefit from that power and wealth, and that how different it is to actually protect the children than just say that and try to dismantle a system that continues to have people who have done others harmed not be held accountable for what they've done. Truly, let's build spaces where survivors don't have to explain why it was abuse. So You've got 3 guides coming at you for you can get a CEU for this. If you become a member of 2X Labs, it's a yearly fee. Y'all, it's not bad. And for those of you who get the 2nd tier membership, any of these longer trainings, you also get included in your membership. For those of you who are on the basic membership, you can get the 1 CEU for 1-hour podcasts, which is lovely. Now, this one is longer than that. So those of you in the 2nd tier can get that CEU. You got to get the post test, and then you can get the certificate for the CEU. But you can also just listen to this for free anywhere you get your podcasts, YouTube. And we'll see if they keep this one up with all of the topics we covered today. So thank you for sticking around to the end. Please head right over to 2xlabs.org to join us on the membership. We'd love to have you, and take care of yourselves. This episode was a lot, and this world is a lot in 2025. I will see you next time.